So, thank you for joining us today, everybody. My name is Claire Howe, and I'll be helping to facilitate this session. If you have any problems during the session, let me know using the chat facility. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the question facility, both of which you should find at the bottom of your screen. I will put as many of these questions as I can to the speakers at the end of the session. Just before we start, I'd like to thank the Arts Council England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund for their continued support. Now I will hand over to Barry in the gallery to get us underway. Thank you, Barry.
Hello, I'm Barry Chandler. I'm the Collections Manager at Torquay Museum. Welcome to the museum's temporary exhibition, The Russians Are Coming, Soviet Spies and the Secret Mapping of Torbay. This exhibition is currently closed, but we will reopen to the public on the 3rd of December, so you'll be able to come and visit. I'm going to briefly explain why we're having a talk on Russian secret maps. Around 18 months ago, we were approached by Nathan Allen of an exhibition company called Bespoke Scientific with the map that you can see behind me, which is this one. This map of Torbay, made in 1976 and written completely in Cyrillic, is simply the most detailed map of the bay we have ever seen. It records every house and building, even garden sheds, and its existence throws up many questions. Who made it? How was it made? And perhaps most importantly, why was it made? Our exhibition tries to answer some of these questions, but we actually really don't know all the answers. Our talk today will explore these questions, and I'm very pleased to introduce the acknowledged experts on this subject, John Davies and Alex Kent. They quite literally wrote the book on the subject, this book, which is The Red Atlas, How the Soviet Union Secretly Mapped the World. This book helped us make this exhibition, and it's a fascinating read. It's the only source on this incredible mapping endeavor, which is probably the greatest intelligence gathering project the world has ever not seen. I'll hand you over to John and Alex, and there will be questions after the talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Barry, and to Claire and to all of the Torquay Museum to today's talk, and thank you for inviting us to give this this talk on this fascinating subject. John and I have been involved in the mapping and looking at the maps of Britain and the world completed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War for the last 15 years or so. I discovered them in Kazakhstan, John in Latvia, and we came together and have, as Barry said, produced the book on these maps. So every single time we look at these, we always find something new and fascinating to discover. So we are really glad to share with you today, especially some of the insights that we've gleaned, not just perhaps on the Torquay sheet, but also perhaps on the wider project. So what I'm going to be doing, first of all, is just going through the wider project, looking at the origins a little bit and some of the topographic map sheets that cover the area, and so you can understand really that this is a multi-scale enterprise that the Soviet Union were involved in. And then John will later on after that focus a little bit on the maps of Torquay, the city plans. But you know, our intention here as well is very much to share what we know and to certainly understand more about these maps, and also to understand any local observations that you of course will know, because you know Torbay and Torquay a lot more than we do. So really we are very interested in what you have to say as well. Right, let's get moving then. And of course you can see a little bit there the first title slide, so the slide of the city plan of Torquay. What I want to do first of all is just to explain some of the origins very briefly of this project. And we have to go right back to the end of the 19th century, where Albrecht Penck, a German geomorphologist, decided that it would be a great idea to map the world at the scale of 1 to 1 million scale. So he divided the world up into grid squares, 1 to 1 million, 4 degrees by 6 degrees, each of those squares, and formed a committee at the International Geographical Congress to get together lots of different countries, colonial powers, effectively, and map the world. Now, to cut a very, very long story short, this was a great idea to pull the resources together of the colonial map makers. But a couple of issues got in the way. Slight minor problem, maybe World War I, followed not that long up later by World War II. And the project really ground to a halt, at least by the 1960s, if not before. Only about 400 sheets were produced out of the 2,000 that were planned. Now, the Soviet Union did actually sign up to this, or the Russian Empire did actually before, but then withdrew quite early on. So they didn't really complete and engage with that project. But they did, however, engage with their own military mapping project. And so what they decided to do was to map the world at not only 1 to 1 million scale, but also lots of other scales as well. And I'll show you some of those scales in a moment. So if we just see here, we've got highlighted this red square, which is the square that we're actually going to be looking at, which is called M30. That square M30 then covers the 1 to 1 million scale sheet on which Torbay, Torquay, and pretty much the southwest of England all falls. So what I'm going to do is go through some examples of these Soviet sheets. This was a military cartographic project, remember, completed in secrecy during the Cold War in cartographic factories and other institutions deep within the Soviet Union. And to give you a bit of a flavour of the level of detail that they were covering at this topographic series of maps. So if we talk about topography, you might think of Ordnance Survey mapping, for example, at 1 to 50,000. Well, the Soviet Union, as I say, completed these sheets at lots of different scales. So this is the 1 to 1 million sheet called M30, alphanumeric for that particular system. And that system is further subdivided so that you can locate any place on the globe by the system. We won't go into that in a lot of detail now. It's in the book if you want to read more about it. So the sheet is called London, 1985, and you can see here the big label for Torbay, and then Torquay. You see that little label in the north there of that extract, and the symbols there denoting that this is a port. You might also be able to work out that the contours are shown in a very sort of generalized way. There's a spot height there of 196 meters, the hill behind. And you might also see that the urban areas are colored in orange, meaning that this is an urban area with a population of more than 50,000 people. So already for a very general assessment of that kind of general assessment of terrain, for example, operational planning, this is the type of scale that will be used. If we move on to the next sheet, thanks, John, we'll see here each of those 1 to 1 million sheets is subdivided into 4, and those 4 sheets at the scale of 1 to 500,000 then allow a lot more detail to be covered. In fact, if you have a look at the left-hand sheet here, the sheet is entitled Cardiff, you can see the mountains of South Wales, Brecon Beacons perhaps just starting to appear, that sort of thing. And then, of course, Exmoor we start to see in the lower half of the sheet. But again, if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see, again, Torbay mentioned, and then Torquay. But you might also notice that some of the bathymetric contours are starting to appear at this particular scale as well. And that is something quite specific to Soviet sheets. When we think about a topographic map and topographic series, we often think of just the land, but here with the Soviet Union, they've actually amalgamated hydrography with topography, so you have depths shown as well. You might notice as well the railway that's shown with the stations, and that indicates again not only where the stops are, but also which direction, of course, the stops face, all of these different things, and the electrification of the lines. So some of that detail starts to appear at that scale. Once we then actually divide those sheets further, there is actually another 1 to 200,000 sheet, which we do not have, but we do have the 1 to 100,000 sheet, which is this one called Torbay from 1980. Remember, these are all produced during the Cold War. And again, that's further subdivision. You can see in the nomenclature there, M30, that tells you the 1 to 1 million sheet, and then subdivided into 144 sheets at the 1 to 100,000 scale. Now at this scale, you start to see a lot more detail, of course. So the urban areas start to appear. You start to see particular buildings that are coloured in, particular factories shown in black, for example, works, all sorts of schools as well, and churches with their own symbols. You might also see vegetation starts to appear a little bit more prominently as well at this particular scale. So again, more detail. If we move forward again, here we have what might be a familiar scale to many of you, I think, the 1 to 50,000. Remember, Ordnance Survey went metric in the 1970s, early 1970s, but the Soviet Union were metric long before that. So 1 to 50,000 sheet would correspond to the Ordnance Survey Land Ranger sheet. And this is the sheet showing Torbay, again in 1980. And again, similar types of features, but you might notice that there's some rock drawings starting to appear on the coast, and again further labelling that we start to see not only in the town centre but also of those bathymetric areas, particularly the bays that you see around the coastline. And again, the roads and streets start to appear, but roads and streets are not labelled at this particular scale. But you might notice again it starts to look a little bit familiar because of that level of detail that you may well be used to. So again, if we start to think that that was the topographic series of maps, that was one whole global project that covered the globe at those different scales. Not all of the globe was covered at all of those scales, but we think most of it at about 1 to 200,000, Western Europe at 1 to 50,000. So a huge undertaking, and obviously several thousand, if not million, sheets were produced. What I'm going to do now is just hand over to John, and he's going to focus a little bit more on the city plans, which will give you a little bit more insight into the street level detail and also of the particular sheets that, that you've been looking at in Torquay. Thanks, John.
So the topographic maps that we've been looking at are continuous coverage, as you saw, and the sheet boundaries are determined, the sides of the sheets are determined by the lines of longitude. So the sheets themselves are not rectangular. The city plans are quite different. They are rectangular, they're based on a local meridian, so they're rectangular sheets, and they're at larger scales, 1 to 10,000, which is 6 inches to the mile, or 1 to 25,000, 2.5 inches to the mile. That sort of scale permits you to put a lot of detailed information on. So of the British ones we know about, we've identified about 100. You can see on the map where they are. There must be a lot more than we have found, because major places like Hull, Carlisle, Cork, we haven't got the plans for. They must exist, and we will keep searching. But these are the ones that we know about, and they date right from the 1950s out here at Pembroke and Milford Haven, which of course were important naval ports. Those maps are dating from 1950s. These other places more concentrated on West Yorkshire, South Lancashire, the Midlands, London, and smaller cities, all those small towns and cities, Dunfermline, Kilmarnock, Gainsborough. So this is a very comprehensive exercise, lots of maps, many of them, as you can see here, multi-sheet, some of them single sheets, and also some of them done. A lot were done in the 1970s and repeated in the 1980s as another survey. So this has been a huge project, and you have to start wondering why it was worth all this effort. But we will, here's the Torbay, the 2 Torbay sheets down here. West of us is Plymouth and Falmouth. But let's look at the Torbay sheet. It's in 2 sheets. There's the northern sheet. Several things strike you immediately about this. There's a lot of the rural hinterland is shown in great detail. So it's not just focused on the city area, the rural area is shown. Torbay, they've been fortunate here. There's plenty of sea, so that some of the important components of the map, as well as the cartographic content, we've got a list of important objects. There are 27 objects listed, and a descriptive essay of about 1,000 words. We'll look at them in more detail. Normally they would appear alongside the map on the same piece of paper, or sometimes even in a separate booklet. But here they're printed in the sea because there's plenty of space. 1976 is the date of the sheet. It's the only one that we know about of this area, but there may well have been another edition done in the 1980s. We don't know that. There's an awful lot we don't know, and we don't even know what we don't know. So we dig away at what we do know and try and devise hypotheses to explain what we've discovered and what we know. The southern half of the sheet, here it is sheet 2, is the southern area with Brixham. Again, plenty of sea, so the street index has been able to be fitted in within the boundaries of the sheet. And again, a large amount of rural hinterland is shown. What I'll do is look at some detail at just 3 small parts of the map. In fact, they're 3 adjacent parts, and they're just south of Brixham. Almost any part of the map you look at, you will be able to pull out a lot of detail, a lot of questions, a lot of curiosities, possibly even some anomalies and errors. But I'll just show you a few, on these 3 little extracts, I'll show you a few of the things that are really worth looking out for, or that mark these maps as different and special. We'll start on the left-hand one, right at the top, and you'll see a spot height of 73.8. But do you notice the contour line there has a little tick, a little short dash on the left-hand side of that contour line. And that's a very useful convention of Russian mapping that you don't see on Ordnance Survey maps. And that indicates the low side of that contour. It's a close contour line, and you wouldn't otherwise know which is the higher or the lower side, but that little tick is just a very helpful convention. Then alongside the main road here, we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spot heights. These are to 1 decimal place of meters. And what's interesting about that is you'd be hard pushed to find an Ordnance Survey map of any date that shows all those heights on it. In other words, those heights have been derived from, they must have been derived from Ordnance Survey sheets, because nobody else puts spot heights on maps. And certainly with the technology of the day, you could not have derived such precise figures from aerial surveillance or anything else. So they must be derived from Ordnance Survey maps, but they must have been derived from several generations, we'll say, of Ordnance Survey maps, because I've certainly been unable to find any map, any individual map that has all those heights on. But I'll lay that out as a challenge for you to try and identify those exact points with those exact measurements on Ordnance Survey maps of the area. But still looking at the rural area, just again, points of interest, the tree symbols differentiating between coniferous and deciduous trees. The great attention paid to things like field boundaries. Look at all these, and differentiating walls and hedges in the field boundaries. Look also, this is quite interesting, where a road enters, here's the main road entering the urban area, and the road showing more as wider in the built-up area, so as to accommodate the road name. So again, that's a convention you won't see on Ordnance Survey mapping. You see it again here on the middle sheet, which is the urban part of Brixham. Here's the main road coming in, and here where it becomes, where it's drawn more widely to put in the street name. This map indicates some of the interesting features. Can you see a little red or purple symbol here with a number 10? So that's one of these important objects that we mentioned earlier. It's numbered, it's color coded, it's purple to indicate that it's to do with government or administration, and it's number 10, and in the index, we'll see in a moment, that indicates that that is Brixham Town Hall, so a municipal building, a government building, it's in purple. Here, can you see a black object, and it's numbered 6. 6 is the color code for industry, and the number 6 is listed on the index, which you'll see in a moment, as the paint factory. And down here may well be a bit of an anomaly. It's colored green, it's numbered 27. The green color indicates that it's something of military significance. The listing tells us it's a telephone exchange. Now, that's, in a way, that's slightly odd, but that's a convention. Military, postal and telegraph and telecommunications facilities, post offices are classed as green, so it's green for being that. However, I don't think there's a telephone exchange there. I think that there's an Ordnance Survey map shows a telephone box in what was formerly a rural area. So before those buildings were there, maybe there was a telephone box, and maybe that's what that's come from. But again, that's a bit of local knowledge that many of you watching will be able to help us understand that. But it's listed anyway, it's item 27, it's coloured green. So as the convention, it's a military object and it's classified and it's indicated on the map. So there's a symbol you can see in the middle here where my arrow is, that's indicating there's a gas holder or a gas cylinder. Differentiation here, the park is illustrated as having different type of vegetation from these other green areas. So that would be a grassy area. We could go on, obviously streets are named, we've mentioned that already, individual buildings are identified. Then if we look at the right-hand extract here, a couple of interesting things I'll draw your attention to here. Down here is a piece of information which is quite useful and again is not derived from any Ordnance Survey origin or source. That tells us the tidal range here is 3 meters. Useful information and hard to derive. And here's St Mary's Bay, that is just disappearing off the edge here. But alongside here, it says Mudstone Coast. Now that's quite interesting. Mudstone is the name for this area, but again, I've never seen any map that calls that bit of coast Mudstone Coast. And it's slightly curious as to whether it's intended as a place name or intended as a descriptive label. Although the word mud coast doesn't, or mudstone I should say, mudstone does not translate in Russian as such. So just in those 3 tiny extracts, you'll see a lot of questions are raised and a lot of interesting points of discussion, which are worth then pursuing on Ordnance Survey maps of the era and earlier eras, going back to the 1920s, if you possibly can. Let's look more closely at other aspects of the map. The marginalia is standard and fascinating. It's very informative. It's absolutely standard and it's really useful information. And I'll start off with what's shown in the top left corner. It says system of coordinates 1942. So that's the geodetic base of the mapping, like modern mapping is WGS 84. So system of coordinates 1942. It then says Great Britain, the county of Devon. Then we can see the kilometre grid and the numbering of the grid, and the north-south numbering is the number of kilometres from the equator, and the east-west numbering is measured from the local meridian that's been used to position this on a north basis. The top right of the map says secret, they all do. The top centre of the map says General Staff, that's the General Staff of the Red Army, that's who made the map. The name of the map, Torbay, says Torquay, Paynton and Brixham. And then very usefully, M30, 53 and 54. So that locates this map, as Alex was explaining, the convention, the International Map of the World Convention. That's huge. So a Russian officer could pick this map up and he would know instantly where in the globe this map relates to. It's M30, 53, 54. Unmistakably, it's that southwest bit of England. That says it's edition of 1976. Down in the bottom centre is the scale and an indication that the contour interval is 5 metres. Bottom right-hand corner has perhaps the most useful piece of information. You see Roman 7, 76. So this says month 7 of year 76, August 1976. So that's when this map was printed. And the D, that's a Russian D, Cyrillic D, stands for Dunayev, which is the Moscow printing plant. So we know exactly when this map was printed. It was printed in August 1976 at Dunayev. The Russian letter I there is the type of map it is. It's a large-scale city plan, that tells us that. The 109 doesn't have any particular significance. That's just a sequence number of the printers. But it does tell us here that it was compiled in 1974. And it also tells us that the unit commander was Colonel A.D. Udin. And these are quite interesting. The names of the cartographers or the unit commanders are shown on earlier maps and you can follow individual cartographers and commanders through, but then they stopped showing them by 1980s. These aren't named. But Colonel A.D. Udin was very prolific, and we can find maps of his of Britain and all over the world, not only city plans, but the topographic maps as well. So he was one of the most prolific map producers, and he did the Torbay sheet. Moving on, here we are. Here's a list of important objects I mentioned. So 27 objects have been identified. As I say, they're shown on the map color-coded, and they're listed here, and they're listed in as much detail as could be established. So, for example, items 6 and 7, if they knew what the factory produced, they would say so. That was the paint and varnish plant, you remember, in Brixham. Number 7, they've named the ownership of the factory. But number 3 and number 14, they knew it was industrial, but they didn't know what. So again, that might help you to identify sources. They could be using trade directories, they could be using city plans, you know, commercial A to Z type street atlases, certainly ordnance survey maps. The transportation is very important. The bus depots identified, all these different aspects of the docks and harbours and the railways are all identified, and other important items of infrastructure like water treatment plants and telephones. And here's our 27 telephone exchange in Brixham, which may or not be true, but it's certainly marked on the map, and it's certainly identified here. And in addition then to all the cartographic illustration, every map has this rather wonderful descriptive essay, typically 1,000, even 2,000 words, describing the terrain, describing the nature of the buildings, the transportation links, all the facilities, all the infrastructure, very beautifully described. I won't read it out to you, it's a lot of it, and I'm afraid there isn't really time for you to read it for yourselves, but it's a fascinating piece of information. But I will draw your attention to just one small thing, which these essays always have this or something like it, and it says, a 410 metre long railway tunnel, as well as quarries located to the west of Galperton, can be used as shelters. Now that's an intriguing piece of information, and we're not quite sure who needs to be sheltered and what from, but this can be, railway tunnels can be used as shelters, does feature quite a lot on these descriptive essays. But the rest of it, you can see industrial and transportation facilities, and it'll describe in detail the port facilities. Does tell us that the main industry is fish. There's a large radio electronics plant and so on. And it tells us about the gas and electricity services, and that the main type of transport within the urban area is the bus. Now, just going wider, other parts of Britain, other maps, other city plans of British cities, just to look at one or two of them, just to show the kind of information that's shown. And rather delightfully, this is the West End of London, of course. It's 1 to 25,000, 2.5 inches to the mile, 1984. And it so happens as an ordnance survey map of the same scale, 1 to 25,000, of the same date, 1984. And putting the two alongside each other is really quite instructive, because I think if you were wandering around London and didn't know your way, you'd get a lot more help from the Russian map than you would from the British native map. Not only has it got the street names, it's got the entrances to the tube stations marked, these little M's in a ring, that's an entrance to a tube station, the metro. It's got things like this, the Kingsway Tunnel, which existed at that time. It's not on the Ordnance Survey map. It's got things, a lot of details about the river. The river name is in uppercase letters, which indicates that the river is navigable. It's got these little ticks which show that the riverside has got a vertical embankment suitable for mooring ships. It's got arrows telling us the direction of that the river's tidal, and the river flows that way. It tells us that railway bridge is of metallic construction. So there's a lot of information on the Russian map, and it's all been achieved without making the map look cluttered, without making the map unreadable. It's still perfectly easy to read the map. It's perfectly easy to derive and understand the information that's being shown. And it's far more informative than the Ordnance Survey map. Moving on, Ordnance Survey convention during the Cold War years was not to show sensitive areas. Here's the naval dockyard at Devonport, and our attention is drawn to the fact that there's something really rather secret there by this very large white space. Anyway, undeterred, the Russians have established exactly what survives or what existed within that space, and listing and naming and numbering all the docks, the railway facilities, the shipyard buildings, and so on. And another rather delightful example, I think this is rather a lovely example because it tells us quite a lot. The top two pictures are of the Upper Hayford US Air Force Base in Oxfordshire. And the Russian map shows us, the OS map on the right does acknowledge that the airfield exists, but tells us absolutely nothing about it. The Russian map not only shows us the runways and the terminal buildings, but there's a very cheeky giveaway here. We can see that the contour, the spot heights, I should say, are faithfully copied across. The contour lines and converted to metric. The contour lines are redrawn as metric contour lines, but this 450-foot contour line, which shouldn't exist on a Russian map, is shown in dotted, saying, well, we're going to show you a contour line there, but it doesn't fit within our convention. It's not an exact number of 50 meters, so we're not going to name it. But there they are, they've copied that on there. They've put their little tick on that we mentioned earlier to show that that's the low side. But the big lovely thing here is this arrow on the road, which rather gives the game away. Here's the arrow on the Ordnance Survey map, which means this is a steep hill. So that's a convention that's known and understood on British mapping. There's no such convention on Russian mapping, so that arrow has no right whatsoever to be there. But the cartographers have thought, well, there's something on this road, maybe it's gates or something, let's draw it on the map. So that does rather give the game away that, yes, they were copying from the Ordnance Survey, but then they added all the things the Ordnance Survey had failed to show us. And the final example is, again, it's an error, it's a giveaway. It shows us that they were copying from Ordnance Survey, but it's also a bit of a giveaway and tells us that human beings make mistakes. This is the Doncaster city plan, and it has a suburb of the city called Roman Pottery Kilns. Well, there isn't a suburb of Doncaster called Roman Pottery Kilns, but what there is an archaeological site, which is the site of ancient Roman pottery kilns, which is marked on something like the 1920s 6-inch Ordnance Survey map. So they had a particular map, a large-scale map of really very old. But not only did they misunderstand the name, they actually got it wrong anyway, because that doesn't say kilns. That item there, that symbol is not the letter N. They've confused the Russian I. There it is. So they've actually put kilis. We don't point this out to make fun of them or mock them or anything like that. What we like to say is that it wasn't some great automatic machine that was producing these maps. It was human beings working, without any knowledge of the place they're mapping and without any understanding of the culture, and making a damn good job, and very occasionally making a little error, which is delight to us to discover because it gives us some little toehold into discovering how these maps were made or what data was used in sourcing them. And these maps go far broader than Britain, and I'll hand back to Alex to just talk about the world context.
Yeah, thanks, John. First of all, I think it's well worth reiterating the point that John was saying, that we can always assume that maps like this are just made by impersonal cartographers, people we don't really know, or that sort of thing. But actually, the more you start to look at these maps again, the more of the humanity sort of comes through, and you realize that these are people actually creating these maps of places where they have not been. And this slide pretty much indicates, again, just the extent of that cartographic endeavor and how incredible it really was. So those city plans which you've now seen of Torbay, for example, and John showed you an extract from London, well, those were actually part of this series that was to actually map towns and cities around the world. We know of about 2,000 of these. So looking at where they're distributed, you can have a look here, and each of these red dots sort of indicates where a city that has been mapped by the Soviet Union as part of that same series. There's obviously a high concentration within Western Europe, particularly Northwest Europe, where we're looking at southern half of Britain, for example. But then have a look at some other places as well, like the east coast of the USA, the east coast of China. Japan is very highly covered as well, if you like. There's a lot of focus and attention there, but there is also a lot of attention played to places that you wouldn't maybe necessarily expect. So again, Honolulu, looking at that, but also towards Australia and New Zealand, countries or cities rather, like Wellington, Auckland, Sydney, for example, are major cities that have been covered as well. So this was a huge endeavour, and again, this is in addition to the topographic maps that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. So a very big endeavour. And what I want to do is just show you some of the examples of these so that you get an idea of some of this, well, this incredible well, legacy really, but incredible endeavour. So here we've got on the left-hand side, this is a sheet from the New York plan, and there are several sheets that cover New York. I think it's about 8 sheets, and here you might just be able to recognize this. This is Manhattan. You can just see maybe the 2 bridges there, the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, you may or may not be able to read, there are some numbers associated with those bridges, 2 annotations, and they indicate some very fascinating information that tells you not only the length and the width, for example, but also when they're fully completed, the construction material. So this is saying they're made of metal, but also saying the height above water of the truss of the bridge, which is also very, very useful. And occasionally, just occasionally, you also get indications of the carrying capacity that bridges could take as well. More so in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and obviously former Soviet Union, former Soviet republics like Lithuania, you see a lot more detail like that, but it's fascinating to see that level of detail here. And you might notice as well that you've got these buildings that John was mentioning. The numbering of buildings goes into the several hundred here. We've got 800-900 items at least for the New York sheets. And if you have a look at the bottom right here, again, staying with USA, well, this is quite a famous extract, perhaps now, I think, where you'll recognize this. This is Washington, DC. Slightly smaller scale than we were looking at with Torbay for both of these sheets, actually. This is 1 to 25,000. This one from 1975. You might, of course, if you have a look at the bottom left-hand corner, recognize the very distinctive shape of the Pentagon, obviously colored green to indicate that it's a military building. But also have a look at the detail in the Potomac River, for example, the bathymetric contours there, the depths. And as John was mentioning earlier with the London sheet, you can see the little ticks along the bank of the Potomac there, for example, and further inland to show, again, the canal, that these were places where you could moor. They're reinforced sides. So again, very, very particular symbology that's been used for that. If we then move on and look a little bit further, perhaps afield, we maybe can go to the Far East. Just to look at a couple of examples here. We've got Beijing, left-hand side, from 1987. You see there the Forbidden Palace, that's all measured, mapped and measured in detail. And you might also notice that there's a bit of a kind of a stripy pattern going on for the buildings that are not numbered, the sort of general location of buildings. And, you know, it's our idea perhaps that this is to indicate not so much detail, but actually to kind of indicate a generalized sense of that urban cover. Again, we're thinking that the source material for these maps, certainly the city plans, a lot of the source material in the 70s and 80s particularly came from satellite imagery, and so there was less access to detailed indigenous mapping that could have helped inform what the land cover and land use of some of these places were. If we have a look on the right hand side there, then the map of Tokyo, this is from 1966, and it's a very strange scale, this one. It's 1 to 20,000. There are not many examples of this scale that we know of, and the style of this map as well is also a little bit different. It's quite strong on the sort of yellows and blues, and we noticed that as time went on, more and more printing plates were added, so more and more colours were added, which meant that more detail could be shown more effectively. John has already made the point that what is amazing about these maps is that they show so much detail, actually so well. There was a real design aesthetic that works exceptionally well with this level of detail. But again, Tokyo, having a look at that, you'll see again the Imperial Palace, you'll see Tokyo Station there in the bottom right hand corner. And there's also an interesting point about Tokyo, not here on this sheet or on this extract of that sheet, but in the top left-hand corner of the 4 sheets that cover the city of Tokyo, there's reference to something called Camp Draku. Now that was a US Army camp that was left over from World War II that was actually Camp Drake, and the Tokyo topographic sheets transliterated that as Camp Draku, which then the Soviet cartographers would have copied and transliterated to turn into Camp Draku in their own Cyrillic language. So rather interestingly, again, it shows that link to the source material. So what is fascinating then to remember in all of this is that this was a real endeavor with real people, of course, and the production of material artifacts from material factories and facilities just like this one. I went to St. Petersburg a couple of years ago in the winter, where it was minus 26 degrees. I didn't really stand around for very long, but this is one of the factories, one of the buildings that quite possibly produced maps like these, possibly the London sheet, for example. And there is in this quite fantastic building a plaque on the outside saying very proudly that this is the 444th military cartographic factory in St. Petersburg, Russia. Obviously, of course, that would have been Leningrad in the time that we're talking about today. But just to give you a flavour of what some of these places would have been like, that obviously made these maps, and obviously the huge endeavour that they would have undertaken within those buildings. Goodness, it must have been a very, very busy place. So hopefully then that's given you a bit of a taste of this fantastic subject. Now, obviously, there is lots more to discover here. We've only really scratched the surface. There will be lots that you know about Torbay, Torquay, for example, that you can find out from these maps, from your local knowledge. And obviously, maybe you have some observations you might want to pose to us. We're always welcome to hear from you. We've got our address, their email address, their author@redatlasbook.com. We've also got the Torbay sheets and many, many others that you can look at for free via a little screen there, little applet, so that you can actually zoom in and have a look at those. I think perhaps some of you already done this, so fantastic if you do that. And you can also order prints of those sheets and many others if you want to, on high quality paper, if you want to put them up perhaps on your wall. But they are pretty big, but they are fantastic to look at, and you always discover something fantastic. So have a look at the website, and obviously do by all means get in touch with us. But of course, we're happy to take questions now to answer those as best we can. So thanks very much indeed for your attention. We hope you enjoyed it.
I'll just mention that I discovered that the book currently is out of stock at Amazon UK, yes. But we do know that there's another supply coming. So if you do want to buy the book and you go onto Amazon, just wait a week or so and it will be there. It currently isn't.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good point.
Okay, thank you both. That was really interesting. We haven't had any questions on the question and answer facility through Zoom. So if anybody has any questions, if they pop them in there now. But I did have a question. So you've talked about how much detail there were in the maps. So do you think that they actually had spies on the streets of the world getting more information, or were they just using lots of different old maps and satellites to get this information?
It's difficult to find something which could only have come from somebody on the ground. That's really what we spent a lot of time doing. Identify every piece of information on the map and like, where could that have come from? Where could you find that out from? And in Britain, maybe round about Chatham Dockyards in the Medway, we started to think, they've got a lot of information about bridges, and they've got a lot of information that isn't easily derived from anything else. So yeah, they may well have had spies, and they may well have had people who unwittingly provided information. There would be people like exchange visits between teachers or trade unionists, all kinds of people during the Cold War going back and forth to Russia, or visiting here. So there may be lots of information, let's say in a soft way, that was discovered and established without being necessarily what you might call spies. But we don't know that. And what we certainly tried to do is look at a piece of information, a spot height or a building or something, and say, or a mistake. Mistakes are brilliant, because if a mistake's got copied from some source, then you've got them. Yeah. But that's really what we've done, like a detective work, trying to find out what could have come. We certainly don't know the names of any of the spies.
No.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. I mean, just maybe to follow up from that, I think also, people say, well, if you've got heights of bridges and that sort of thing, well, surely all of this would have been derived from satellite. To which, well, I would say, yeah, it's possible to get heights from stereo pairs. We know that this is something you'd have to have done to create the contours, for example, but it is not systematic. When we have a look at the bridges, for example, around the world and around the UK, if this was something that could be easily determined from satellite imagery, then why not systematically include it? But it's not systematic, it's more sporadic. So that perhaps suggests that there was some other maybe sources, people on the ground or something. But yeah, the true answer is, of course, we don't know, but yes, quite possibly.
Okay, thanks.
I see questions are pinging in now, Claire.
Yeah. We've got lots of questions. So we've had a couple of questions that were asking about if the maps, do you think that the maps were to support an invasion?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Well, I think it's very interesting whenever we have any sort of contact, particularly with the media about this, the key headline is always that these are invasion plans and so on. And I think our understanding of this is that really these maps follow a long tradition of topographic mapping that basically assumes to create absolutely everything and assemble that information on a map. So we have to remember that these were maps that were created during the Cold War, when paper was the dominant mechanism for storing, recording, and sharing and communicating information. So everything that was known, in a way, was then put on the map to be used for all sorts of different purposes, possibly. So it's hard to say that these were specifically invasion plans, because there is just simply perhaps too much information that would be irrelevant to that particular type of use. I know also, if we wanted to create invasion plans, there were other information that you might also want to put on that perhaps would indicate where to go, which areas to take, for example, much more thematically and specifically to help that, rather than a broad repository like this. So that's my view. I think John maybe also have a that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say the cartographers wouldn't know what the maps are for. The cartographers would be told, collect as much information as you possibly can, put it on the map, because one day it may be useful. I think you have to assume that the assumption, the underlying assumption, why would so much money get spent on this, would be that probably eventually the whole world will become communist, and when it does, we'll be in charge, and we need to know this stuff. It matters where the bus station is and where the post office is. They're not target maps. We're not going to destroy this. There's no point in not mapping to this level of detail if you're planning to bomb it all. But maybe there is if you thought one day it's ours and we need to know, we need to run the city.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
10 more questions.
Yeah, there's plenty more questions. So a couple of people have also asked, how did you get the maps? Where do you find them?
Yeah, let's not go into that one. We'll let everybody search for themselves for the maps. All we'll say is, if you want reprints of the maps, you can go to our website. But let's look at the maps themselves. Never mind where we got them.
Okay. So we've also got a couple of questions about the contours. So someone's asked, why were there so many different spot heights included? And somebody else has asked about interpolating between the OS contours to get their metric ones. And did that mean that they were inaccurate? And how could they get them accurate without having somebody on the ground? So I've confused that, haven't I?
Right. No, that's all right. Alex, do you want to do this or shall I?
Yeah, well, you start off, John, if you like. I know you've looked at the
Right.
contours in detail with the OS maps, and I'll follow up if necessary, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, why the spot heights are there, I think they wanted to get as much information about the terrain as you possibly could. That matters. Where you find a spot height on the map, it's a particular number. It isn't it isn't guessed or judged. If they put a spot height, it's accurate. And the question is, where's that information come from? And almost always you will eventually find an Ordnance Survey map that has that information. The contour lines could be interpolated, and indeed they are on Ordnance Survey maps, by looking at the ground and interpolating where the lines are. But yeah, Alex, have you?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just following up on that part, I think that's a very interesting question. I think one thing that we discovered that was really interesting for us is when we noticed that for some of these plans, they mentioned the a very interesting source. I think it's one of the sources on the Belfast sheet, which is 1964, of a 1940 sheet at 1 to 10,000, and that turns out to be basically a German enlargement of a captured Ordnance Survey 1 to 10,560 sheet that was then obviously used as a source by the Russians. And again, you know, that might be something they captured when they invaded Berlin and so on at the end of World War II. But what is really interesting is if you compare that sheet with that source sheet with the map, so there's another map of Dover, for example, that uses a similar sort of thing, you find that actually the contours have been created from scratch. They haven't simply been copied over. So I think what is crucial perhaps to understand in all of this is that what the Soviet Union tried to do was to comprehensively remap as much as possible for their own purposes, the topography and the terrain and the land cover and the land use as possible, because that meant that they could rely on that information quite possibly if they needed to go to war and use these maps. The other slight side angle to that is that there was an eminent distrust in the mapping of capitalist nations from within the Soviet Union. So they would assume that if you have mapping, certainly topographic mapping, that was publicly available, which was not in the Soviet Union, publicly available in capitalist countries, the conclusion was it must be falsified, because why on earth would you allow anyone to have access to detailed and accurate, crucially militarily important information like terrain? So because of that other reason as well, it's quite likely that that whole philosophy of trying to remap everything then met with a real effort to try and do that. And they had the means to do it. They had cartographic satellites to
and remember there's bathymetric contours as well.
Yeah.
This doesn't stop with the land. The sea and the estuaries, the rivers are done the same. And that's even harder to collect.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily, because Ordnance Survey don't show contours beyond the coastline. So and the Russian ones don't generally tie up with Admiralty surveys either. So there's more questions and answers.
Oh, yeah.
More questions and answers.
Okay, we'll just have two more questions, I think. So the first one is, do the British or anybody else have any equally detailed maps of the Soviet Union? Was anybody mapping the Soviet Union in this way?
Well, that's another good question. I think the key thing to bear in mind, you have to look at this from the other perspective in a way and say, look, the Soviet Union is a vast country. So the mapping of the Soviet Union itself is an absolutely huge undertaking. It was completed under Stalin in 1954 at 1 to 100,000, and then only by 1988 had it been completed at 1 to 25,000, which is pretty large scale. So this was a massive undertaking to go anywhere near that. The maps that we tend to see from the NATO side of things are a couple of different strands, if you like. There's the Joint Operation Graphics, which are principally air navigation sheets at 1 to 250,000 and 1 to 500,000. So much, much smaller scale that we're dealing here, and therefore much fewer details. But also there are the city plans that we see that NATO and specifically the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, that used to be called NEMA, produced as well. Now, when we do any sort of comparison with those sheets, we find again that there is a very much more economic approach to mapping. So nowhere near as as much detail as you would see on a Soviet city plan, and obviously then in terms of topographic mapping, nowhere near in terms of the detail. So really, I guess the point was that once the Soviet Union had been mapped, the rest of the world really wasn't much of an effort.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was an interesting answer. So there are a few other questions, but the one that I think most intrigues me is, so somebody has asked about how you think they got the information for the secret areas of the map. So the ones that are covered up in the OS maps for military bases, and they've got all the buildings on. How do you think they got that information? Because they won't have been able to get that from other maps, presumably.
Yeah, okay, I'll start first perhaps. Well, again, one of the interesting sources that we seem to find again are the German mapping, let's say certainly the Ordnance Survey maps, but even then, those maps, of course, would not have that level of detail on that we would expect. So we actually think that some of these early city plans, for example, the early Soviet city plans, could well have used captured German reconnaissance aerial images or aerial photography at that time. That's probably where some of that would have come from, because the Soviet Union weren't flying reconnaissance flights over the UK, at least to our knowledge, at the end of World War II. But then much later, by the time we got to the sort of mid-1960s and certainly into the 70s, we then had the launch of the Zenit program of topographic or cartographic satellites by the Soviet Union, and those would have provided a lot of the base imagery needed for the mapping, quite detailed mapping of these places at those scales. However, that only gives you land cover, it doesn't give you land use. So in terms of working out the names of factories, the functions of buildings, that sort of thing, that would have had to have been combined, if you like, with those other sources like John mentioned, trade directories and other sorts of things to give you that sort of detail. But again, it's hard to say because a lot of those docks, and particularly the example that John put up of Devonport, that would have been quite difficult to find. I think John might have a view on that as well.
We'd love to know.
Yeah,
is basically the answer. As I say, more questions than answers. All we've done is looked at the maps and tried to figure out what it all means. We don't have a source in the Soviet Union who made these maps who can tell us, and we would love to.
Oh, thanks very much. I don't think we'll have any more questions. I think we'll finish it off there. Thank you, John and Alex. That was really interesting talk. I don't know, Barry, do you want to say anything before we go?
Just thank you, John and Alex. That was fantastic, really interesting. And I'd just like to say to everyone who's watching to recommend your book because it's a really, really good read. I've read it all. And I didn't think I would find a book on Russian maps that interesting, but it is really fascinating. So I'd recommend anybody, if you can track down a copy for Christmas, go and buy one.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll end everything there. Please get in touch with the museum or with John and Alex if you want any more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.